Hey, traveler. Tonight, I thought we'd talk about insane things medieval queens did that 99% don't know. Where are you in the world right now, and what time is it there? Let me know in the comments. It's wonderful to know where our fellow travelers are joining us from tonight. Beyond the crown, reframing insanity in medieval queens. What would you do if your every decision, your every mood swing was scrutinized, judged, and potentially weaponized against you? Now imagine that scrutiny amplified by the immense pressure of ruling a kingdom, securing an alliance, or producing an heir. This was the reality for medieval queens, and what we often label as insanity needs a serious reevaluation. Think of it as historical gaslighting on a grand scale. The term insanity itself is a slippery eel even today. Back then, it was even more subjective, often used as a convenient label for any behavior that deviated from societal expectations, especially for women. A queen who dared to challenge her husband's authority, express independent thoughts, or even exhibit strong emotions could quickly find herself branded as mad. It's like accusing your cat of being dramatic when they're just being a cat. But what good is a diagnosis of insanity without understanding the context? Medieval queens lived lives of immense pressure and limited agency. They were often pawns in political games, their marriages arranged to secure alliances, their primary duty to produce male heirs. Their personal desires and ambitions, and even their physical and mental health, were often secondary to the needs of the crown. A queen's value was often measured by her fertility and obedience, not her intellect or personal happiness. Speaking of limited agency, this brings us to the power of perception. Political maneuvering was a constant in medieval courts, and queens were often active participants, whether overtly or covertly. Any attempt to influence policy, challenge the king's decisions, or protect their own interests could be easily misconstrued or deliberately exaggerated as evidence of instability. It's like when your boss calls your innovative idea unrealistic. The difference? Your boss probably won't lock you in a tower. Now that we've covered the context and political climate, let's talk about the specific examples of insanity that have been attributed to medieval queens. Key takeaway: what looks like madness often masks political strategy, personal desperation, or simply being a woman in a world that didn't value female agency. One prime example is Joanna of Castile, often known as Juana la Loca, or Joanna the Mad. What would you think of a woman who carried her dead husband's coffin around with her? History paints her as a woman driven mad by grief and jealousy, incapable of ruling. But consider the context. Joanna was the rightful heir to the throne of Castile, but her husband, Philip the Handsome, and later her father, Ferdinand II of Aragon, actively sought to undermine her authority and seize power for themselves. Her perceived madness conveniently served their political ambitions, allowing them to declare her unfit to rule and effectively sideline her. If you've ever felt like you're losing your mind dealing with difficult family members, imagine that amplified by royal intrigue and power struggles. Joanna's actions, while unconventional, could also be interpreted as a desperate attempt to assert her authority and maintain control in the face of relentless opposition. Think of it like a medieval version of fighting for your seat at the table, except the table is a kingdom, and the stakes are much, much higher. But what good is a queen without power? From Joanna of Castile to other queens branded as mad, a pattern emerges. Women who challenged the status quo, who dared to exercise their power in ways that threatened the established order, were often labeled as insane. It was a convenient way to discredit them, silence their voices, and remove them from positions of influence. Key takeaway: insanity was often a political tool used to disempower women in power. Now that we've talked about political motives, let's consider the impact of societal expectations. If you've ever felt pressured to conform to societal norms, imagine that amplified by the weight of a crown. Medieval queens were expected to be pious, virtuous, and above all, fertile. Any deviation from these expectations could be interpreted as a sign of instability, even madness. Speaking of societal expectations, this brings us to the issue of postpartum depression. What would you do if you have no support while trying to recover from pregnancy? Childbirth was a dangerous and often traumatic experience for women in the Middle Ages, and postpartum depression was likely a common occurrence. However, there was little understanding or recognition of this condition at the time, and a queen exhibiting symptoms of depression or anxiety after childbirth might be labeled as unstable or even mad. It's like diagnosing a broken leg as laziness. The difference? The queen's laziness could cost her the throne. Hey, what's more fun than a history lesson? A history lesson with a healthy dose of skepticism. So when you hear about a medieval queen being mad, remember to dig a little deeper. Consider the context, the political motivations, and the societal expectations that shaped her life and her portrayal in history. It's time to reframe our understanding of insanity and recognize the complex realities faced by these women who ruled in a world that was often hostile to female power. Key takeaway: medieval narratives require a second look. Poison, plots, and power plays. Navigating treachery at court. Ever wonder what it was like to be a queen in the Middle Ages? It wasn't all tiaras and tea parties. More like tiaras and terrifying treachery. What would you do if survival meant outsmarting not only your enemies, but also, potentially, your own family? The stakes were impossibly high. Power meant safety, and losing meant, well, losing everything. We delve into the shadowy world of medieval queens who had to be as cunning as they were regal. Think Cersei Lannister, but with slightly less access to hair dye and a significantly higher chance of being poisoned at breakfast. Speaking of breakfast, let's talk about Fredegund, a queen of the Merovingian Franks. If you think modern politics is cutthroat, imagine vying for power in a world where murder was practically a hobby. Fredegund wasn't just playing the game, she was the game. She was a woman who understood the power of whispers, the impact of a well-placed rumor, and of course, the effectiveness of a poisoned goblet. Her rival, Brunhilde, another powerful queen, was constantly in her crosshairs. It was a real Game of Thrones situation, except instead of dragons, they had slightly less reliable methods of execution and significantly worse dental hygiene. Fredegund's rise to power was, let's say, unconventional. Legend has it, she orchestrated the murder of her husband's first wife, Audovera. The details are murky, but the result was clear. Fredegund became queen. Now that we've covered Fredegund, let's talk about Brunhilde, Fredegund's eternal rival. Brunhilde was no saint herself. She ruled Austrasia with an iron fist, navigating political landscapes with the skill of a seasoned chess master. The feud between Fredegund and Brunhilde wasn't just a personal vendetta. It was a clash of kingdoms. It was a conflict that spanned decades, filled with battles, betrayals, and enough cloak-and-dagger intrigue to make Machiavelli blush. Now that we've covered Fredegund and Brunhilde, let's talk about a tool they used: poison. If you've ever watched a detective show, you know how crucial poison can be in a murder plot. But medieval people, they lived it. The difference was, CSI wasn't around to solve the cases. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when your alternative was open warfare, subtle assassination suddenly looked brilliant. Key takeaway: medieval queens often lived in a world where survival depended on their ability to outmaneuver their enemies, sometimes through less than savory means. Plots were as common as fleas on a peasant. Queens were constantly scheming, not just for power, but for survival. Picture this situation. You're a queen, surrounded by ambitious nobles, jealous relatives, and enemy kingdoms eager to exploit any weakness. What do? You plot. You build alliances, gather intelligence, and prepare for the inevitable betrayals. Long before modern intelligence agencies, medieval courts were hotbeds of espionage. Spies were everywhere, disguised as servants, courtiers, even clergy. The information they gathered could make or break a kingdom. But what good is information without the means to act on it? This brings us to the crucial role of assassins. Assassination was a common tool in the medieval queen's arsenal. It wasn't pretty, but it was effective. Think of it as medieval problem-solving. Problems like, "My rival is about to depose me," or "That nobleman is plotting against my son," could often be solved with a well-placed dagger. The difference between now and then? Uber Eats now delivers more quietly. Of course, queens weren't always the aggressors. They were often targets themselves. Protecting themselves and their families was a constant struggle. Many queens employed bodyguards, often chosen for their loyalty and ruthlessness. They also relied on trusted advisors who could help them navigate the treacherous political landscape. Imagine having a job where your performance review depended on whether you lived through the week. That was life for a medieval queen. From plots to assassinations to self-preservation, medieval queens were masters of political maneuvering. They had to be. Their lives and the fate of their kingdoms depended on it. Key takeaway: medieval queens had to be adept at navigating a complex web of alliances, betrayals, and constant threats to their power and safety. Navigating treachery at court required a unique blend of intelligence, charisma, and ruthlessness. If you've ever tried to mediate a family argument, you have a tiny glimpse of the diplomatic skills required. Queens had to be able to charm allies, intimidate enemies, and negotiate treaties. They had to be skilled communicators, able to convey their intentions without revealing their true motives. It was a delicate balancing act. Speaking of delicate balancing acts, queens also had to maintain the image of piety and virtue. They were expected to be models of feminine behavior, even as they were engaging in ruthless political machinations. This created a fascinating dichotomy:
the pious queen, and the cunning politician. It was a performance, but it was a performance that could determine their fate. It was like walking a tightrope while juggling flaming torches and trying to smile for the cameras. Ultimately, the stories of queens like Fredegund and Brunhilde offer a glimpse into a world of high stakes and ruthless ambition. Their actions may seem shocking by modern standards, but they were a product of their time. They lived in a world where power was often seized through violence and treachery, and where survival depended on one's ability to adapt and overcome. Their stories remind us that history is rarely simple, and that even the most powerful figures can be shaped by the circumstances they face. Key takeaway: the actions of medieval queens, while sometimes shocking, reflect the ruthless political realities of their era. These women were not passive figures in history. They were active participants who shaped the course of events. Their stories deserve to be told, not just as tales of intrigue and violence, but as testaments to the resilience and resourcefulness of women in a time when power was often denied to them. So, next time you can't sleep, remember Fredegund and Brunhilde. Their stories may be unsettling, but they are also a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can endure.
What if the only way to survive was to betray your own blood? It sounds like a plot from a modern thriller, but for medieval queens, it was sometimes just Tuesday. This chapter delves into the fascinating, often terrifying world of royal alliances, where queens weren't always docile pawns, but cunning strategists who played their own game, sometimes against their own families. Imagine Cersei Lannister, but with slightly less wine and a higher chance of contracting dysentery. Now that we've set the scene, let's consider Eleanor of Aquitaine, a queen who redefined the game. If you've ever felt stifled, imagine being married to a king whose personality was about as exciting as plain toast. Eleanor, married to Louis VII of France, found his pious nature and lack of ambition utterly unbearable. So what did she do? She went on a crusade. Not exactly a couples retreat. But medieval people didn't have therapists. The difference was, instead of working on their marriage, she used the opportunity to explore the Holy Land and, rumor has it, explore other possibilities. Sure, it wasn't a modern divorce, but when your alternative was a lifetime of pious boredom, a scandalous adventure suddenly looked brilliant. Speaking of scandalous, Eleanor eventually divorced Louis and married Henry II of England. Talk about upgrading your royal status. But this wasn't just about love. It was about power. Eleanor brought with her the vast Duchy of Aquitaine, a region larger than England itself, making Henry the most powerful ruler in Europe. Key takeaway: marriages in the medieval period were as much about land acquisition as they were about love, something like a medieval merger. But the story doesn't end there. Eleanor, ever the independent spirit, eventually clashed with Henry. Think of it as a really messy family feud, but with armies and castles. She supported her sons in their rebellion against him,
effectively waging war against her own husband. Can you imagine Thanksgiving dinner after that? It was a bold move, almost unheard of for a queen. The difference was that medieval queens were expected to be symbols of piety and obedience, not rebel leaders. Sure, it wasn't perfect, as it led to her imprisonment, but when your husband was trying to diminish your power, rebellion probably seemed the only option. Now that we've seen a queen challenge her husband, let's move on to one who defied her own family. Picture this. You're a princess, betrothed to a powerful ruler for political gain. But what if that ruler is your family's enemy? This was the situation faced by many medieval queens, forced into alliances that went against their personal and political inclinations. Take, for example, some of the Byzantine princesses who were married off to Western European rulers. If you have ever felt like a fish out of water, that would be a good comparison. The difference was that they were not allowed to use the internet or social media to learn about their spouse's cultures. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when your family needed to secure a treaty, personal happiness was a small price to pay. Key takeaway: medieval queens were often bargaining chips in a game of thrones, but they weren't always passive players. Speaking of passive players, let's be clear. These queens weren't saints. Their motivations were often complex, a mix of personal ambition, political necessity, and sheer survival. They could be ruthless, manipulative, and even cruel. After all, these were women living in a brutal age, where power was everything, and morality was often a luxury. The difference was that the morality of the time was vastly different than it is today. But what good is power if you can't use it to shape the world around you? Many queens used their influence to promote their own agendas, whether it was supporting the arts, patronizing religious institutions, or even influencing political decisions behind the scenes. They might not have held official titles, but they wielded considerable power, often through their relationships with their husbands or sons. You might think of them as shadow rulers, pulling the strings from behind the curtain. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when your options were limited, you made the most of what you had. Now that we've talked about power, let's consider the risks. Defying expectations came at a price. Queens who challenged the status quo often faced opposition, criticism, and even danger. They could be accused of treason, heresy, or simply being unwomanly. Their reputations could be ruined, their lives threatened. The difference was that medieval queens were seen as property by their families and husbands. But what good is playing it safe when the world is changing around you? The unconventional alliances forged by medieval queens often had far-reaching consequences, shaping the course of history in ways that are still felt today. They challenged traditional power structures, redefined the role of women in society, and paved the way for future generations of female leaders. They demonstrate a certain ingenuity given the limited options they had. The difference was that the queens often had to face political turmoil and challenges alone. The unconventional choices of queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine remind us that history is rarely simple. It's a messy, complicated tapestry woven with threads of ambition, betrayal, love, and loss. And in the midst of it all, These remarkable women carved out their own destinies, leaving a lasting legacy that continues to fascinate and inspire us today. After all, even in the darkest of nights, a queen can still light her own path. Key takeaway: medieval queens, against all odds, were able to carve out their own destinies.
The price of fertility, medical madness, and the burden of succession. If you've ever felt pressured to meet expectations, imagine the weight on a medieval queen. Her primary duty? Produce a healthy heir. Failure wasn't just personal. It could destabilize an entire kingdom. It was like a medieval reality show, but with way higher stakes, and the viewers included all the dukes, lords, and scheming relatives. So, what did medieval medicine offer these women? A mixed bag, to say the least. Think of modern fertility treatments, sophisticated hormone therapies, IVF, precise monitoring. But medieval people had recipes involving powdered unicorn horn, potions made from questionable herbs, and prayers to every saint known to intercede in matters of the womb. The difference was, well, everything. Sure, modern medicine has its own challenges, but at least it's not based on folklore and superstition. When your alternative is trusting a court physician who also believes in dragons, suddenly even the slightest possibility looked promising. Key takeaway: desperation drove queens to embrace bizarre and dangerous remedies. Now that we've established the dire situation, let's talk about some specific treatments. One popular belief was that the womb wandered around the body, causing all sorts of ailments, including infertility. The solution? Hysterical suffocation, a procedure involving fumigating the lower regions with unpleasant odors to lure the womb back into place. Imagine that, being subjected to noxious fumes in the name of fertility. Honey, I Shrunk the Kids seems almost sensible in comparison. Talk about a bad day at the medieval spa. Speaking of unpleasantness, consider the concoctions ingested to promote conception. These often involved ingredients like goat's blood, animal organs, and copious amounts of wine. The idea was to cleanse the body and prepare it for pregnancy. It probably just caused a terrible hangover. You know how Grandma always said a little hair of the dog? These queens got the whole hound. But what good are bizarre remedies without some good old-fashioned bloodletting? It was thought to balance the humors, the bodily fluids believed to govern health. Too much blood? Bleed it out. Not enough? Still bleed it out, but maybe a little less. The logic was circular, to say the least. You can't help but think these queens thought that their doctor was probably just thirsty. The results could be disastrous, weakening the queen and further jeopardizing her health. Key takeaway: medieval medicine was a gamble, often doing more harm than good. Multiple miscarriages and stillbirths were a recurring tragedy for many queens. The grief and trauma associated with these losses were immense, amplified by the pressure to produce an heir. Imagine the constant scrutiny, the whispers, the political ramifications of each failed pregnancy. It was a relentless cycle of hope and despair. They say that one is bad enough, but multiple times throughout your life while the future of your kingdom hangs in the balance?
I'd probably just quit and start a convent, honestly. From physical ailments to mental health struggles, the burden of succession took a toll on medieval queens. The constant stress, the ineffective treatments, the repeated losses. It's no wonder some women succumbed to what was then termed melancholy or madness. It's easy to judge from a modern perspective, but consider the weight of their world. In modern times, we have things like therapy and mental health, but back then, here's a vial of leeches, get better soon. Now that we've explored the physical and mental challenges, let's address the issue of infant mortality. Even if a queen successfully carried a child to term, there was no guarantee of survival. Disease, poor sanitation, and lack of medical knowledge meant that many infants died in their first year of life. Can you imagine having to deliver 10, 15 children just to ensure the survival of one heir? It's a horrific statistic. And the worst part is, that's why these queens kept going. To modern parents, the idea of losing a child is unimaginable. But medieval queens lived with the constant threat of infant death, adding another layer of anxiety to their already burdened lives. The christening ceremony wasn't just a religious ritual. It was a desperate attempt to protect the newborn from the perils of the world. Sure, modern parents worry about germs and screen time, but they rarely fear their child will succumb to a simple infection. Key takeaway: the high rate of infant mortality cast a long shadow over medieval queens. As if the medical madness wasn't enough, queens also faced political machinations and courtly intrigues. Rivals might spread rumors of infertility or question the legitimacy of their children. Every pregnancy was a political event, scrutinized and manipulated for advantage. It's hard enough dealing with morning sickness. Imagine doing it while simultaneously fending off power-hungry relatives. It's like a medieval version of Housewives, but with real power struggles and potential beheadings. Now that we've considered the political aspect, let's look at the Queen's role in securing alliances through marriage. Royal marriages were often strategic partnerships, designed to strengthen kingdoms and forge alliances. But for the Queen, it meant being used as a pawn in a larger political game. She might be forced to marry a man she didn't love, travel to a foreign land, and adapt to a new culture, all in the name of political expediency. In modern times, we value love and personal fulfillment in marriage, but medieval queens had little say in their marital arrangements. They were expected to fulfill their duty to the crown, even if it meant sacrificing their own happiness. It's like being forced to participate in a medieval arranged marriage reality show with no chance of winning true love. And, as we've previously discussed, the prize is constant pregnancy. Fun.
The crackling fire casts dancing shadows on the walls as the night deepens. Sleep may elude you, but perhaps a journey into the past will offer a different kind of rest. Tonight, we delve into the surprisingly turbulent religious lives of medieval queens, saints, sinners, and those who walked the razor's edge of heresy. What would you do if your deepest convictions were perceived as a threat to the very foundation of your kingdom? Medieval queens weren't just about pretty dresses and producing heirs. They were often deeply involved in the religious life of their time, acting as patrons of the church, influencing religious policy, and sometimes they had visions. If you've ever felt a deep connection to your faith, imagine that amplified 1,000-fold, placed within the context of a world that saw the divine in every aspect of life. But medieval people did not have social media. They used letters. The difference was that the spread of information in medieval times depended on those you trusted. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but it was effective. Take Isabella I of Castile, for instance. This powerful queen, known for her role in unifying Spain and sponsoring Columbus's voyage, was also intensely pious. Isabella saw herself as a divinely appointed ruler, tasked with purifying her kingdom of heresy and promoting the Catholic faith. This zeal manifested in the Spanish Inquisition, a brutal institution that targeted conversos suspected of secretly practicing their old faiths. Imagine being the queen and thinking that you are chosen to take your country to a higher place. Long before cable news, it was the churches that set the tone. The difference was the church dictated everything. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but it was the only way they knew. Isabella's religious fervor extended beyond persecution. She was a devout Catholic who spent hours in prayer and was known for her austere lifestyle. She funded the construction of numerous churches and monasteries, and she actively promoted religious education within her kingdom. Her piety was widely admired, and many saw her as a saintly figure. But Isabella wasn't always popular. Key takeaway: religious conviction, in Isabella's case, was a potent tool for consolidating power and shaping her kingdom's identity. Now that we've covered Isabella's fervent piety, let's consider the potential pitfalls of such intense religious devotion. In a world where the line between divine inspiration and demonic influence could be blurry, queens who experienced visions or claimed to have direct communication with God risked accusations of heresy. It was a dangerous game. Picture this situation. A queen, deeply devout, begins to experience visions. She shares these visions with her court, believing them to be messages from God. But some, perhaps threatened by her influence or skeptical of her claims, begin to whisper that these visions are not divine, but demonic. Accusations of heresy begin to circulate. This was more common than you think. The consequences could be dire. A queen accused of heresy could face excommunication, imprisonment, or even death. Her power could be stripped away, her reputation ruined, and her kingdom thrown into chaos. Remember, in the medieval period, religion wasn't just a matter of personal belief. It was deeply intertwined with politics and power. Speaking of power, this brings us to the ways some queens utilized their religious beliefs to further their political agendas. Claiming divine favor could legitimize their rule, inspire loyalty among their subjects, and provide a moral justification for their actions.
Religious authority was a potent weapon in the medieval queen's arsenal. What good is X without Y? What good is being the queen without the power of religion? But medieval queens weren't always motivated by purely political considerations. Many genuinely believed in the power of prayer, the importance of religious rituals, and the need to uphold the teachings of the Church. Their faith could be a source of comfort, strength, and guidance in a world filled with uncertainty and danger. Ever wonder how people handled stress back then? They prayed. Key takeaway: religious faith provided medieval queens with both power and purpose, but also with significant risks. From fervent piety to accusations of heresy, the religious lives of medieval queens were complex and multifaceted. They navigated a treacherous landscape where faith, power, and politics were inextricably linked. And through it all, their actions shaped the course of history, leaving a lasting legacy that continues to fascinate us today.
As the moon hangs high, casting long shadows, let's delve into the shadowed corners of history, specifically the reputations of medieval queens. How much of what we know about them is truth, and how much is carefully crafted propaganda? If you've ever seen a smear campaign unfold in modern politics, you have a glimpse into the kinds of character assassinations medieval queens faced. Now, take Marie Antoinette, the infamous "let them eat cake" line, almost certainly fabricated, yet it cemented her image as a detached, uncaring aristocrat. Imagine a medieval queen facing similar accusations, but without Twitter to defend herself. The difference was the narrative control held by the powerful men around her. Sure, she might have been genuinely flawed, but the whispers could be amplified into deafening roars, effectively destroying her influence. Speaking of amplified whispers, let's consider accusations of infidelity. Long before reality TV, accusations of infidelity were the bread and butter of political scandal. A modern politician's affair might be splashed across the tabloids. A medieval queen's rumored indiscretion could lead to accusations of treason and the loss of her head. The stakes were somewhat higher. It wasn't just about personal embarrassment. It was about the stability of the realm. Key takeaway: reputation was currency, and control of the narrative was power. But what good is reputation without considering the sources of information? Picture this situation. A chronicler employed by the king, tasked with recording history. Is he going to write about the queen's bravery and political acumen if she opposes the king's policies? Probably not. Here's the thing. Medieval history was often written by those in power, for those in power. The queen's version of events? Often lost to time, or filtered through the lens of her enemies. It's like relying on your rival's Yelp review to understand your restaurant. Good luck. Ever wonder why certain queens are remembered as wicked stepmothers or scheming harlots? Consider the source. Often these portrayals served a specific purpose: to discredit their lineage, justify their removal from power, or simply to warn other women not to step out of line. It wasn't just about hating the queen, it was about controlling all queens. If you've ever seen the latest season of Bridgerton, you know how gossipy royal circles can be and how fast a queen can fall from grace. This was basically reality television, only with actual beheadings. Now that we've covered the sources of propaganda, let's consider the specific accusations leveled against these queens. Think of the most damaging rumors you can imagine: adultery, treason, even witchcraft. Basically, anything that would undermine their authority and cast doubt on their legitimacy. Adultery, of course, was a classic. A queen's primary duty was to produce an heir, and any hint of infidelity could throw the entire line of succession into chaos. It's like a very high-stakes paternity test with kingdoms on the line. From adultery to treason, sometimes the accusations were even more outlandish. Imagine being accused of plotting against your own husband, the king. It's like accusing your Uber driver of trying to sabotage your vacation. Highly unlikely, but incredibly damaging if believed. And if the queen was already unpopular, those accusations could spread like wildfire. Key takeaway: outlandish accusations were a powerful tool for undermining a queen's power. Speaking of outlandish, let's talk about witchcraft. In an age of superstition, accusing a queen of witchcraft was a surefire way to turn public opinion against her. If you've ever tried to explain away a technical glitch, you know how easy it is for people to jump to wild conclusions. Now imagine that glitch is a crop failure, and you're the queen. Suddenly, you're not just incompetent, you're in league with the devil. It wasn't exactly fair, but fairness wasn't exactly a medieval virtue. But what good is a reputation tarnished without some examples? So let's briefly re-examine some historical cases with a contemporary lens. Consider Eleanor of Aquitaine, a powerful and influential queen who was often accused of meddling in politics and even plotting against her husband, Henry II. If you've ever had a disagreement with your spouse about finances, you can imagine the tension in a royal marriage when the queen has her own vast wealth and political power. The difference was that Eleanor's meddling was seen as a threat to Henry's authority, and she paid the price with years of imprisonment. From Eleanor of Aquitaine to other less well-known queens, the pattern repeats itself. Powerful women accused of transgressions, their reputations shredded, their legacies forever tainted. Think of it like a celebrity scandal, only the consequences are far more severe. Sure, a modern celebrity might lose endorsements. A medieval queen might lose her life. It wasn't exactly a level playing field. Now that we've seen some examples, let's consider how modern interpretations can shed new light on their actions. What if Eleanor's meddling was actually skillful diplomacy? What if the accusations of witchcraft were simply a way to silence powerful women who challenged the status quo? If you've ever felt misunderstood at work, you can imagine how frustrating it must have been for these queens to be constantly judged and criticized by a patriarchal society. The difference is perspective.
We can now look at these historical figures with a more critical eye, questioning the narratives that have been passed down through generations. It's not about blindly accepting the historical record. It's about understanding the context in which that record was created. Think of it like rewatching a movie you saw as a child and suddenly noticing all the subtle messages you missed the first time around. Key takeaway: modern analysis allows us to challenge historical biases and re-evaluate the legacies of medieval queens. As our historical exploration concludes, remember the power of narrative and the importance of critical thinking. The stories we tell about the past shape our understanding of the present, and it's our responsibility to question those stories and seek the truth, even when it's buried beneath layers of propaganda and prejudice. Perhaps the true insanity lies not in the actions of these queens, but in the narratives constructed to define them. The quiet hours of the night offer a unique space for such reflection, a time to challenge assumptions and seek deeper understanding. I wish you sweet dreams, and I hope you enjoyed this historical journey.